Hey Providence, and welcome to our Maundy Thursday experience. My name's Jack Allen. I'm the pastor at Providence, and however you found us, I'm grateful you did. I'm grateful you tuned in to join us in our Maundy Thursday experience. This is a little unusual. Usually on Maundy Thursday, we'd be gathering in our sanctuary. We'd be reading the story and being reminded of Jesus and his last meal with his disciples as he washed the disciples' feet, as he instituted Holy Communion when he said, "Take this cup and this bread, and when you eat and drink, do this in remembrance of me." And usually we would gather in our sanctuary and take communion, one of our two sacraments of the church. But of course, we're not able to do that. No, we're in our own homes, and so we're going to do something a little bit different. At the end, I'm going to invite you to gather in your own homes around the table for a love feast. We'll say more about a love feast at the end of this video, but I just want to tell you that there are more resources available to you on our website, providencemethodist.org. If you go there are two documents: what is a love feast and an order for a love feast. You can find those there. Again, we'll say more about that towards the end of this video. But I figured right now, since we have this opportunity to kind of pause and reflect and ask questions about why are we doing this? What's so important about Maundy Thursday? What does Maundy Thursday even mean? How is this connected with the Last Supper, with communion, with the Seder, with the Passover? Where do all these things connect? Do they even connect? Are they just fancy buzzwords that gets thrown around at the same time of year and somehow they get associated together, but they're really not? Well, I figured this would be a good time to unpack some of these things. And as Mary Poppins would say, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. We go all the way back to the second book in the Bible, the book of Exodus, in fact, where Moses has been called by God. You recall Moses was saved, he was in Egypt, and then Moses fled Egypt. Moses encountered God at a burning bush. God said, "Moses, I'm sending you back to Egypt. I want you to go back and I want you to save my people. I want you to bring them out of Egypt." God says, "I've heard the cries of my firstborn, and I'm going to bring them out of Egypt, out of slavery, into freedom, into the promised land." And so Moses goes, and he speaks to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, "No, I will not let your people go." And so then God, through Moses, sends the first plague, and then the second, and the third, the fourth, fifth, the sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth. And finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh allows Moses to go, allows Moses' people to go, God's people, to leave Egypt, to cross the Red Sea, to make their way into the wilderness and eventually the promised land. But that 10th plague, remember, that's the most deadly one. That's the cursing of the firstborn son. That's where all of the Egyptians' firstborn sons are struck and killed on that evening. Except for the Israelites, right? Because they have this time where they mark their doors with blood over their door frames with the sacrificed lamb. And they eat it, and there's instructions for all these things. I want to read to us a little bit from the book of Exodus. This is going to begin in chapter 13. And this is chapter 12. And this is the instructions for what is supposed to happen. It says this: "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, 'This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb should be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on 2 of the doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you should eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. So this is God's word to Moses, saying this is what you're supposed to do on this evening. Again, you're supposed to slaughter this lamb, paint the door frames in blood. That way it'll protect you from the Passover. The Spirit of the Lord will pass over your house and go on to another. And then after that, you're to remember it. And so the Passover is instituted as this ordinance, this meal that's supposed to be celebrated year after year after year. It's supposed to remember this time that God saved you, that God redeemed you out of slavery, out of Egypt, and brought you into the promised land. In fact, in just the very next chapter, 13 verse 8, it says this: You shall tell your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. The reason why we do this meal over and over, we celebrate Passover and over, the Israelites did, is a way to tell the story to our children, is a way to tell the story of God to the younger generation, to keep the story alive in the community. Passover serves as a time to do that. In fact, we read a little bit later in Deuteronomy that this is what occurs. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 16, it says this: You must not eat with it anything leavened. We'll come back to that in just a moment. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt. So this is one of the very few passages we get after Exodus, after the Israelites ate the Passover meal for the very first time. In fact, the rest of the Old Testament mentions it very briefly. We get some passages in Numbers or Kings or Chronicles, but it's more about saying things like, and then the Israelites observed it, or it's a king calling the Israelites back to remember and to bring back Passover, to bring back celebrating the Passover feast, the Passover meal. And so since we don't get a lot of details in the rest of the Bible about how it was observed post-Exodus, the only thing we really have to work with is going back to Exodus to look at how this meal was eaten, what they were doing, and what we might take away from it. One of the first things you probably notice is this idea of unleavened bread, right? That they're called to eat unleavened bread. Leaven makes bread rise. And so if your bread is, if the bread rises, then it has leaven. If it's unleavened, then it doesn't rise. It's more or less like a cracker. So think of like a saltine cracker or something, that's unleavened bread. Think of something like we have for communion, like King's Hawaiian loaf, right? That's a risen. That has leaven in it. And so they're called not to eat any bread with leaven in it. Why? Because bread takes time to rise. Did you catch when we read the Exodus passage? They're supposed to eat this meal hurriedly, is what it tells us. They're supposed to eat this meal quickly. We don't have time to wait around for bread to rise. Just eat it like it is, as a cracker. In fact, not just as a cracker, but while you're at it, they said, go put your sandals on. We can translate this for us, I think, for modern day. What Moses is telling the people there, what God is telling the Israelite people to do as they eat this Passover meal for the very first time in Egypt, God says, go get your Nikes on. Get ready to run. Don't wear a suit. Don't wear some khakis and a nice button down. You need some running clothes. Get ready. That your loins girded, right? Get ready to move. Get a staff in your hand, like a hiking stick or something, because you're going to get ready to go. Again, all this points us to God is getting ready to act. God is getting ready to move in Egypt. And as soon as this 10th plague passes through the land, Pharaoh's going to tell Moses, take your people away. Take God's people away. Get them out of here. And so when Pharaoh says that, the Israelite people have to be ready to move. And so they eat it hurriedly, right? They don't wait for the bread to rise. They eat it standing up, and they eat it ready to go with staff in hand and sandals on, and they're not relaxed at all. They're just going quickly because they don't know when God's going to call and God's going to call them to move. And so that's the first Passover meal that we have, eaten with bitter herbs and everything else. It's not very tasty. It's not something where we sit down and enjoy the company of one another. It's pretty quickly, pretty rushed as they get ready to eat this meal, as the angel of death passes over their houses, and then they get ready to move out of Egypt. And again, that's just about all we get in the Old Testament from the Passover meal. So if we fast forward to the New Testament, then we get the questions of, okay, so what was Jesus doing? What was Jesus doing with his disciples in the last meal? I'm going to read to you from the book of Luke. Luke has this to offer us. He talks about getting ready for the Last Supper that he celebrated with his disciples. And this is Luke chapter 22, and he says this. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover meal for us, that we may eat it. They asked him, where do you want us to make preparations for it? Listen, he said to them, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters, and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, already furnished. Make preparations for us there. So they went and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared for the Passover meal. So this encounter that we have in Luke's Gospel, this story we have in Luke's Gospel, is very similar in both Mark and Matthew's Gospel. We'll get to John in a second. But it tells of this first day of Passover, where Jesus instructs his disciples to go and make preparations to celebrate the Passover meal. In fact, did you notice that first verse 22:7? They came to the day of unleavened bread, right? The day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Remember, this is still in the time of the temple. The temple is operational. They're able to go and make sacrifices at the temple, and so that is the place where they're able to go and to sacrifice a lamb, where they can slaughter a lamb and then come back and eat it in celebration of the Passover meal. And so this is the day when the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. This is the first day of Passover, and so Jesus tells his disciples to go and get ready so they can celebrate this meal together. Now, it's here where some of us tie in the Seder meal. The Seder meal is a popular phrase we may have heard today. It's a Jewish custom, a Jewish tradition to have a Seder Passover dinner. When the Seder started is difficult to say. We locate it sometime around the destruction of the Second Temple, so after Jesus' death and resurrection, around 70 A.D., and scholars debate on whether we had the Seder meal before or after the destruction of the temple, but it's right around then when this starts to become popular. You see, before the destruction of the temple, when we had the ability to, as Jewish people, as Israelites, to go to the temple and to make sacrifices to prepare the Passover lamb to eat the Passover meal, that's what good Jewish people would do. They would go to Jerusalem, they would make the sacrifice necessary to then have the Passover meal. But after the destruction of the second temple, that's no longer an option. So what do you do if you can't go to the temple to sacrifice this lamb? Well, then you bring the Passover meal into your own homes. And that's a very simplified way of describing it. That's what the Seder is. The Seder brings the Passover meal into the homes. And so there is, like I said, some evidence to suggest maybe some of the writings and teachings and some of the liturgy used for the Seder, maybe that existed before the destruction of the second temple. But what seems clear is that after the destruction of the temple, when there's no longer the option to sacrifice a lamb, and you had to bring that Seder, that Passover meal into the homes, that's when the Seder meal really becomes popular and kind of takes hold in Jewish custom. And so it's probably unlikely that Jesus celebrated the Seder, although again, we really don't know what exactly Jesus was doing with his disciples other than eating the Passover lamb. That's the only thing Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us consistently, is that they made preparations to sacrifice this Passover lamb and then eat it with his disciples. Beyond that, we don't really have any evidence or anything to suggest one way or the other. But John's gospel is where it gets interesting. John's gospel is where things turn. John has a very peculiar way of telling John's story. And so in John's gospel, he starts this way. This is again when his disciples are gathered. Chapter 13, just the first verse here. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that the hour had come to depart from this world and go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Before the festival of the Passover, John puts Jesus' last meal with his disciples before the festival of Passover. Why? Why did John do this? Well, if it's before, if the last meal is before, that means that as we move through the events of Holy Week, as we move through the final days of Jesus' life, that when Passover begins, the day in which the Paschal Lamb is to be slaughtered, in John's Gospel, that's the day that Jesus is crucified. John is trying to make very clear to all of those with ears to hear that Jesus is the Paschal Lamb. Jesus is the one who was given. Jesus is the Lamb to be slaughtered for all of us. Jesus takes the place for all of us, that the angel of death might pass over, that death won't have the final word for us anymore. While Matthew, Mark, and Luke try and suggest that Jesus is observing the Passover meal with his disciples, which probably chronologically, that's probably correct. John isn't concerned about any of those things. Historical accuracies, John could care less. John's trying to make a deep theological point here. Jesus is the lamb that was slaughtered. And so the final meal, again, with Jesus and with his disciples in John's gospel occurs before the festival of the Passover. That's not the only thing that John's gospel gives us that we carry on with us today. In fact, Maundy Thursday really and truly comes from John's gospel. Maundy Thursday comes from the Latin word mandatum. Probably didn't pronounce that right, but we'll go with it. It's the Latin word, it means commandment. And so Maundy Thursday really means Commandment Thursday. Well, what commandment? Why is this Commandment Thursday? Again, John's Gospel, still in the 13th chapter, this time beginning in verse 34. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. It's interesting to note, this is called a new commandment, right? Again, that's Maundy Thursday, Commandment Thursday. But why is this a new one? After all, didn't we already have the greatest two commandments, love God and love your neighbor? Why is this a new commandment for us? It's right in the middle of that verse we just read. Just as I have loved you. How has Jesus loved us? Sacrificially. Jesus says at another place in John's Gospel, what love is greater than one that lays down their life for another? The new commandment that we get from John's Gospel is not just to love, not just to have love in our hearts, but love with action, to love sacrificially, to give freely. This is also in John's Gospel where we get the foot washing story. You know, that thing that happens on Maundy Thursday service where you show up and you say your prayers before you get there and say, please, dear God, let us not do the foot washing tonight. Let us not be one of those churches. Right, that's the thing we usually say if we're being honest. We don't want to do that because it's weird, it's awkward. It's like, come on now, let's just forget the feet. Let's just go to communion. But in John's Gospel, it's a key critical point. Because when you would enter into a home and you'd get ready to observe this meal, there was things that would happen that were considered honorable things and things that were lowly things, as you can imagine. It was considered honorable to take the pitcher and the bowl around and to be able to wash hands, to be able to get a place where you could wash others' hands when you were observing the Passover meal. That was traditionally a thing of honor, but to wash feet, again, in sandals, walk around the desert, pretty disgusting. That was for the lowly. That was for those that were lower than those that were eating and sharing this meal together. And so when Jesus humbles himself, when he gets down on a knee, when he begins to wash feet, Jesus is giving us an example, even right then and there, of sacrificial love and what it looks like. I will take on the role of a humble, lowly servant for you, my disciples. And what are we called to do? This new commandment? To take on the role of a servant as well. To become humble and lowly servants. To serve not just God, but also our neighbors. As Jesus says, that is how they'll know that you're one of my disciples, by the way in which you love one another. And so this is the Passover meal. This is the story we're remembering. Again, anytime we get together and we celebrate the Passover, we remember this meal on Maundy Thursday, what we're recalling is going all the way back to Egypt, where God took the Israelites out of Egypt, where he delivered them from slavery and brought them into the Promised Land. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we get Jesus Christ, who comes along and celebrates this meal and then offers us and institutes Holy Communion. And says, this is the last meal I'm going to share with you. And so when you get together, do this in remembrance of me. Eat this bread, drink this cup, tell the story, and do it in remembrance of me. Just like for Exodus, when Moses says that we're going to do this over and over and over again because we're going to tell our children the story. We're going to pass the story down from one generation to the next. So too do we do that in communion. When we gather together, we tell the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. We tell the story again and again and again and again as a way to pass it down from one to the next. One final verse for us that comes from 1 Corinthians. This is Paul now speaking in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And I'm going to begin in verse 6 here. He says this, your boasting is not a good thing. Do you not know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old yeast, so that you may be a new batch, as you really are unleavened. For our Paschal Lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul points us to, again, that Jesus is the Paschal Lamb that's been sacrificed. Jesus is the one who has offered this to us. And so when we get together and we celebrate communion, when we come together in this way, as Paul says, that we celebrate this as a festival, that we get rid of the old yeast of malice and evil, and we bring in sincerity and truth. And again, usually we would do this on Maundy Thursday. Usually we would celebrate communion together. But since we can't, we're going to tap into a different tradition that we have. A tradition that goes all the way back to Wesley, and he bumped into this with the Moravians as well, but something called a love feast. A love feast is a little bit different. It's not communion, but a love feast is designed, as the name would imply, for those that would like to join together in fellowship and Christian love to share a time together. And so again, on our website, there are instructions for how to do a love feast. It's pretty simple. All you need is dinner tonight. So if you're eating dinner, great. Don't eat it just yet. Eat dinner at the end of the love feast. And the other thing you need is bread. And it can be anything. It can be a roll of bread. It can be a loaf. It can be a slice of bread. It can be a cracker. It can be any type of bread you have. You'll need some type of bread. And then again, eat dinner after the love feast is over. But what's designed to do in the love feast is you're supposed to sit around the table with you and whoever. And so this could be done in small groups. This could be done in Sunday school classes. In the old days, in Wesley's days, this was done because of circuit riders when they would go around from community to community, the pastors that is, and they would celebrate communion. What would you do if the pastor wasn't in town? You would have a love feast, because you didn't have somebody there to administer the sacraments. And so without the pastor, you'd have this love feast. And so this evening, as we're all gathered in our own homes, I invite you to share in this love feast together. And the great thing is with technology, if you are gathered with your family this evening, fantastic. You're all set and ready to go. If you're not gathered with others this evening, that's okay too. Because of technology, we can do it virtually. Call up somebody and do it over the phone, or put a couple people together on speakerphone, whatever you have to do there to celebrate this time together. Because at the heart, what a love feast is reading scripture, is sharing personal stories, personal testimonies, and encouraging one another in the faith. That's what we do in a love feast. We serve one another in that way, and we offer up the ways in which God has been at work in our lives. And so again, those resources are available on our website. I encourage you to go and check those out. That's what we're going to do tonight. That is our Maundy Thursday experience. We're going to share a love feast. Again, just follow that order, and then after the very end of it, share your regular Thursday night meal together. But as you do so, I invite you to recall this God who's been at work in the world from the very beginning. This God who called Moses, sent him to Egypt to pull the Israelite people out, God's firstborn. He said, I heard the cry of my people, and I am bringing them out of Egypt and into the promised land of milk and honey. This God who pulled the Israelites out of exile and said, I am going to write a new covenant on your heart. This God who sent his only Son to die for our sins. This God who calls us even this night and says, you brothers and sisters, you have a place at the table. You have a place to share in this love that we have with one another and this love we have in God. That same God is at work wherever you're sitting right now. And so whoever you're gathered with, know that when you gather this evening for that love feast, you gather in the presence of God. Go in peace and enjoy the fellowship of one another.